Thank you, Judy. Uh, I'm glad to be here this morning, but I first have to express my disappointment. And the disappointment is that I had expected that I'd be able to be at the society with some members, at least in a hybrid meeting. But actually, when I last spoke several years ago, I fully anticipated when I spoke next, it would be in the room in Garden City with people in the room with me. Speaking this way on Zoom is a very different experience, and clearly not the same as it is being in person. And something very critical is lost. We are deprived of meeting people face to face. We two-dimensional images are simply not the same as being three-dimensional. Right now, I have my screen set up so I could both read my notes and I could look at you at the same time, but my screen doesn't let me see everybody who is here. There's only a certain limit that I have in the gallery view. So I have lots of little images of some of the people who are here and not everyone else. That's, I think, a big loss. We can't, in this format, we literally cannot touch one another. We could see one another, but we can't really touch one another. So much is lost when we don't really see people's body language. I could see people nodding their head, but there's much more to body language than simply head movement. Another thing that we lose, and we don't often think about this, is that we lose our sense of smell here. And I remember very vividly when I returned to Kenya after not seeing a friend there for probably 15 years or so, the first thing he said to me when we got together was, "How good it is to smell you." And I thought that that was very peculiar, but it really is not. The sense of smell is very important to us. Just ask somebody who's had COVID and lost their sense of smell. Along with that goes a sense of taste. That is that we lose some of our critical senses when we're in this format, and talking in a room by myself is different than talking in a room with people where I could be very responsive to them as they respond to me. So, having said that, there's also something that we've gained. And what we've gained on Zoom is that without it, Rich wouldn't have been here this morning. He now lives out at the east end of Long Island. Wayne wouldn't be here this morning because he lives in Maryland. Al wouldn't have been here this morning because he lives in New Jersey. And Cable wouldn't have been here this morning because he lives in Florida. I may have missed some of people this morning who are not local to Nassau County. Sorry if I've overlooked you, but clearly at least 4 people who are here this morning wouldn't have been able to participate in this meeting, or wouldn't have participated in this meeting, except that we were forced to move to this format. We didn't choose it. It was imposed upon us. We had to deal with it, and we've made the best that we could with it. We're not the only ones who've had to make this kind of adjustment. I was forced to do it at Hofstra when I was teaching my class a year ago, March, and suddenly in the middle of the semester, we were told we can't meet in person anymore, and we had to switch to Zoom, and scrambled very, very quickly within just a few days to go from in-person teaching to Zoom teaching. And it worked better than I had anticipated. We lost something, but we didn't lose an entire semester. So schools have continued to adapt to this, to the new environment in which we live. I'm also active in the Faith Leaders Advisory Council to the District Attorney. So I meet once a month with people from different religious backgrounds, and I could tell you a year ago how difficult and how almost panicked other religious leaders were trying to figure out how they will continue to have their Sunday morning services, how they'll continue to have their Friday night services, how they'll be able to keep their Friday afternoon services intact. But they did. They managed somehow to do this. Workplaces have managed somehow. Some businesses went under, others adapted. They figured out how to continue to remain profitable, how they have adapted to now outdoor eating, which some of us actually think is delightful and hope that they continue. Theaters, the whole theater industry was weakened and really by the pandemic. Many of them figured out how to do this. And some of them found it to be extremely creative. They were able to do things that they had never dreamed of before. So what I'm saying is that something has been imposed upon us. This wasn't of anyone's choosing. We've had to adapt. Some have done it successfully, some have not. So here we are. The larger point is, and I think everybody recognizes this, is that change is constant. Sometimes we want to change. We look at ourselves and say, we could do better. Sometimes, and probably far more often, the change comes from the outside. It's imposed upon us. Things happen to us that weren't of our own making, not of our own choosing, but we need to deal with them. It was Confucius who said that those who would be constant in happiness or wisdom must change often. So those who want to be constant in happiness or wisdom must change often. Well, that was said, what, 2,500 years ago. It was the recognition that, even what we think of as being traditional and stable societies also were undergoing constant change. How do we deal with this? Well, one of the changes that I just learned about last night that will be imposed upon me is that the service that I use for my cell phone is no longer going to support my, what I guess will now be antiquated flip phone. I have chosen not to have a smartphone. I see no reason to have it. I see it as an intrusion. I see people who are addicted to it. I'm bothered by it when I'm with people who choose to respond to it or look up stuff instead of being present with me. So I've kept my flip phone, which has served me fine. When I need to make a call, I'm out shopping to tell that I'm going to be home late, I'll give her a call, or she'll give me a call. Otherwise, I don't even bother to pick it up. Many times I even forget to bring it with me. But T-Mobile is no longer will be supporting flip phones. So either I'll have no cell phone, or I will be forced to have a smartphone. Obviously, I will get the smartphone. I didn't want it, but now I have to figure out what to do when I can no longer have my preferred flip phone. So what do we do when change is imposed upon us? Well, I think there were three basic responses to how we deal with change. One is that we can embrace it full-heartedly. These are some people who are early adapters to technology. Something new comes out, they want to be the first to have it. They will get it immediately. They'll stand on lines for long hours so they could be the very first to get whatever it is that's the new technology. Or if you're more philosophical or religious, there are people who embrace every change by saying something like, well, everything is for the better. That's one way to respond to change. Another way to respond is by adapting. That is, figuring out what is most beneficial under these circumstances. What do we lose? How do we regain what we want to have? How, in fact, can we make things better than they've ever been because of the new circumstances? And the third way is to reject change and to resent it and be fatalistic. And you hear the phrase, which people often say, is, well, it is what it is. And so that's it. Nothing can be done. So I would take these thoughts and want to apply it to who we are in the ethical movement as ethical humanists, who choose to spend our time, our energy, some of our finances into supporting the ethical movement, and in particular, this ethical culture society. Well, I want to do this first by looking backwards a little bit. And that is to say that the ethical movement today is very different than what it was when it was founded in 1876 by Felix Adler. Felix Adler was the son of a rabbi. He came from a wealthy family, and he was trained as a philosopher. And one of the things about Felix Adler was he rejected the term humanism. He did not consider himself a humanist, opposed what he called humanism. Nevertheless, having made these changes in the movement over 150 some odd years, the values which he was committed to and the principles that he was committed to, those have remained permanent. He rejected humanism, just to add here as a footnote, because he understood that ethics really was permanent. It was part of the fabric of the universe. It wasn't something that was created out of human experiences or choices. So that was why he rejected humanism. I'm not so sure he would reject humanism as we've now come to understand it, but nevertheless, if he came back, I think, was reincarnated today, somehow magically appeared, and saw that we called ourselves a humanist society, he would be very unhappy. I think that if he attended a meeting, he would have been mystified by the music that we play. At the New York Society, it was always, and still to this day, is classical music. And they have a very good, expensive, large organ in the meeting room. And they often will be playing their music that would be organ music. I think Adler would be shocked by our attire. He wore a morning coat. All men wore suits. Women wore dresses, hats, and gloves. I think he wouldn't understand what our milestones are about or why we have them. And I think he certainly would be opposed to us singing. And I don't know what he would make of our moment of silence. All of this would be very new, would be very peculiar to him. But something remains the same, and that is the rejection of the supernatural, the idea that it is deed before creed, the importance of reason, and the commitment to social justice. These remain the bedrock of who we are, whatever our form might be, whatever label we may give ourselves. So you may wonder why we moved from ethical culture to ethical humanist, at least here on Long Island. That occurred in 1965. And it was mainly a rebranding by the businessmen who ran the society, who dominated the society at that time, which was, look, if you're going to sell something, you have to have, it has to be called something that people understand. And the term, the Society for Ethical Culture, is a mouthful and not understood by very many people. What in the world is that? They thought it was essential to keep the name ethics as in it, but they didn't think that culture communicated what our society was about. They wanted to make sure by keeping the word ethics as part of us, it was to make sure that it wasn't to be confused as an atheist organization. It wasn't to be understood as a social justice program or a social services agencies. Well, we may have elements of all of that as who we are, but that doesn't define who we are. That comes out of who we are. We are dedicated to a proposition which we had on a signboard in the society for many, many years. Apparently, when we cleaned not so long ago, it fell down, it broke, it wasn't there for a number of years, but it has been redone and put up as you walk into the meeting room. And it says, the place where people seek to meet the highest is holy ground. Now, some people are bothered by the word holy, but I think if you think about this and why we put it up, it is pointing to something which says that what we're after is more than simply mundane interactions. It means more than simply being complacent with our lives. We're after something that we really can't quite put our hands on. It's intangible, but it really is important for us to seek. Other changes under Felix Adler is that when he began the ethical movement, all the leaders were not called leaders at the time, they were called lecturers. So it went from a lecturer to a leader. It went from a lecture hall to a meeting house. And from a meeting house, it went to something that resembles a congregation. In suburbs, more congregational than in the cities, which are very far from congregational in nature. Music at the beginning and at the end as a frame, that we've kept, but it was understood as a frame, not as a mini concert. Now, the music that was supposed to be played at the beginning, and of course we have to adapt to the fact that this was a change that was imposed upon us this morning that we hadn't anticipated. But let me tell you, the music that we were supposed to have played this morning was Imagine. Of course, the John Lennon song, everybody knows it. This was a very interesting adaptation of it because it is from a group called Music for Change, I think is what it's called. What they do is that they have people all around the world, each playing the music together. And the video features different soloists at different times. Again, something that could not have been done without this kind of technology that allows people all over the world to do something together simultaneously. It's really quite remarkable. So I want to look at change here in the ethical movement. I want us to imagine. That's why I chose that piece at the beginning. I'd like us to imagine. I would like all of us to go on this journey, creative, imaginative journey. If we could imagine that the ethical movement was not founded by Felix Adler, not somebody whose father was a rabbi, not somebody who came from a wealthy family, not somebody who was in some ways a high Victorian, and not somebody who was a philosopher. And instead, I'd like us to consider three people this morning who might have founded an ethical movement. It's not far-fetched. I'd like us to consider not a philosopher, but a gay poet. Not a man, but a woman novelist. Not a white philosopher, but a Black sociologist. Now, you may have guessed that the three people I'm talking about are Walt Whitman, George Eliot, Marianne Evans. She used the name George Eliot because she couldn't get published as a woman, and W.E.B. Du Bois. What if these people had founded the ethical movement and not Felix Adler? I could have added a couple of other people here, but it would take too much time and it goes too far afield. But one of them would have been Mohandas Gandhi, who said that the most influential book he ever read was something called Spiritual Ethics, I think it was Spiritual Life or an Ethical Life by Salter, who was a leader of the Chicago Ethical Society. Gandhi said that was the most influential book in his life. So Gandhi possibly, or Confucius 2,500 years ago, who in my mind is without a doubt a humanist. Let me start with Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, born in 1819, died in 1892. He spent much of his formative years in Camden, New Jersey, just on the other side from Philadelphia. And the person who wrote his biography, and who was a lifelong friend of his, Horace Traubel, was a member of the Philadelphia Ethical Society. And many followers of Walt Whitman were members of that society for years. Whitman never, as far as I know, never did become a member. But let me read one more poem of Walt Whitman's just to give you a clearer sense of how much of a humanist he was. He wrote, "I hear America singing. The varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon into mission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing and washing. Each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths, their strong, melodious songs. This, like almost everything else in Whitman, is a celebration of the common person, embracing that which binds us together as individuals in a universal self. It also is an emphasis and a recognition of the centrality of justice and personal freedom. It's an acceptance of differences, and it's a reverence for nature. Whitman is a sweep of humanity and cosmic connections. And it calls for participation, not passivity. It wants us, he demands that we be engaged with other people, with the world around us. So if Whitman were to have founded the ethical movement, what would we be like? I say that we would be a congregation of joy, with song and poetry, our themes. And what would be the music? Not classical music, not organ music, organ recitals. I think it would be jazz. The second person that I would like us to imagine having founded the ethical movement is George Eliot, that is Marianne Evans, the English novelist, born in 1819, died in 1880. She was a follower of the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who founded the religion of humanity in France and spread throughout Europe and a little bit in this country. It was a precursor to ethical culture. Clearly, Felix Adler was influenced by Comte. And there was a London ethical society that was founded just a couple of years after George Eliot died. If she had been alive when there were, I think, 4 societies in London, it would not have been a surprise to me if she had become a member. She said at some point, the old religion said, heaven help us. Our new one, from its very lack of that faith in the heaven, will teach us all the more to help one another. She emphasized the interdependence of human beings, searching for values to live by in a rapidly changing world. She thought that the goal of a novelist was to enlarge our sensibilities, and in particular, to be more appreciative of the lives of women. So what would an ethical cultural society be like if it had been founded by George Eliot? Here's what I imagine. Assemblies would be filled with stories, personal anecdotes. It would be far more conversational and less analytic. So what would the nature of this congregation be? I would describe it this way. It would be a congregation of compassion. And what would our music be? I think that there would be ballads and perhaps chamber music. And the third person I want to look at and for us to imagine is W.E.B. Du Bois, born in 1868 and died in 1963. He knew Felix Adler. They worked together on many committees, many places, helped even found together the NAACP. And most recently, our newest leader in the ethical movement, Jay Hooper, did a film in which he imagined an encounter between Felix Adler and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Du Bois was a sociologist. He was a scholar, but he was a scholar who was concerned with bringing his scholarship into the everyday affairs of people. And his focus was on race and religion. And what was the significance in particular of religion in the lives of people who are Black? He said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Unlike Felix Adler, who said that he thought the problem of our times was the labor question. Du Bois had a different perspective. His was color. Adler's was labor. Du Bois, in his own life, moved away from theism and from conventional religions. He said that religion is important if and when it concerns itself with human life in its finitude, in its complexities, in its challenges, when it transforms institutions for human betterment, particularly when it comes to matters of race. He said, believe in life. Always human beings will live and progress to greater, broader, and fuller life. And why a religion? For Du Bois, he clearly saw that, especially for Black folks, a congregation was a place for personal support and for social change, where the tragedies and hardships of life can be overcome through mutual responsibilities that extended beyond friendship. Places where great attention was paid to our predecessors and to our ancestors, where the people who came before were not forgotten, but continued to play a role in our lives, for better, sometimes for worse. But we shouldn't forget them. They are part of who we are because they helped make us into who we are. And we therefore have an obligation to the future generations for that very reason. So what would an ethical society be like if it had been founded by Du Bois? I think it would have been more sermon and less of an address. There would have been more physical movement and not having people sit still for 50 minutes and listen to other people talk. There would have been movement and there would have been greater participation and certainly more singing. His congregation would have been a congregation of uplift. And what would have been the music? I think it would have been the blues. Well, change from without can't be stopped. So we must adapt, but we can't lose sight of the basics. And humanism has some fundamentals. And here's what I think they are. We have an anthropology. We don't have a theology. In other words, we look at what makes human beings, not with any supernatural intervention, but through human and natural processes. And mainly it is that we are born into a society. We are born into institutions. And amongst those institutions are our families, education, the economy, religion, and politics. We inherit a way of seeing. We inherit a way of being. And our well-being cannot be separated from the well-being of others. We are asked as humanists to accept what is good about what we have inherited, to reject that which violates human dignity, to promote the centrality of human welfare, and to value the uniqueness of each person and every individual. There is a aphorism, we don't have very many in the ethical movement, but one that we often recite with Felix Adler's. I want to rework it, and here's how I would put our most central aphorism of what it means to be an ethical humanist. Live in such a way as to make human flourishing a possibility for everyone, and in so doing, create your finest and best self. Now, Joan, I hope we'll have the next piece of music. We began with Imagine, the John Lennon song, and I've asked you this morning to go on an imaginary journey with me. And I want to end with a song that I think is responsive to George Eliot. And of all the aphorisms that I have rattling around in my head, the one which I most prefer is from Eliot, who said, "What do we live for, if not to make the world less difficult for one another?"